know that most of what you've seen, read, or heard about Billy the Kid is untrue? My name is Gail Cooper. I'm a medical doctor and forensic psychiatrist. My specialty is murder case consultation for the defense. For 20 years, I've used my expertise to uncover the real Billy the Kid. Researching over 40,000 pages of archival documents and books, I've written the revisionist history. It's shocking, it's liberating, and I've written books demolishing the hoaxes, hijacking the history. My talks will share with you what I've found. Cover-ups, misinformation, and fakery, to use Old West lingo, will bite the dust. This talk presents my revisionist history of Billy Bonney's pardon bargain with New Mexico Territory Governor Lew Wallace. The information is from my book, The Lost Pardon of Billy the Kid. A mystery has been why Billy Bonney didn't get his pardon from Governor Lew Wallace. He believed Wallace promised it to him in March of 1879. In a March 4, 1881 letter from the Santa Fe jail, Billy wrote to Wallace, "I have done everything that I promised you I would, and you have done nothing that you promised me." It's remained a mystery because the answer is complex. It involves the nature of the pardon bargain, the psychology of Lew Wallace, the motives of the corrupt Santa Fe ring controlling territorial government, and the deficiency of Billy's attorney, Ira Leonard. Solving the mystery gives insight into Billy Bonney's courage and anti-ring zeal, and to the Lincoln County War freedom fight, which the pardon would have vindicated, along with Billy himself. The outcome of Billy Bonney's pardon bargain to Governor Lew Wallace depended on political and psychological factors beyond their control. It would alter both their lives, yielding Billy's death and Wallace's guilt-ridden obsession with hiding his betrayal. When Billy Bonney and Lew Wallace first crossed paths on March 13, 1879, Billy was recently 19 and Wallace almost 52. Each was in crisis. Billy, in the year past, had lost a life as a ranch owner and protege of John Tunstall to become a hunted outlaw. Wallace, intending a quick fix to flee his backwater governorship, was mired in a military crisis that risked his future and flashed back to his Civil War scandal. That was the Battle of Shiloh, in which he got lost and missed the battle's first day. Each saw the other as famous and needed the other. Risking hanging, Billy needed a pardon to free himself from ring prosecution. Wallace needed to prove pacification of the territory to escape its political quagmire and get rewarded by an exotic ambassadorship. From opposite ends of the social spectrum, they were surprisingly similar. Both longed for unattained fatherly love. Both had lost young mothers to tuberculosis. Both were cast out too early and too harshly from home. Both felt wrongly outlawed, Billy by the ring for rebelling, Wallace by General Ulysses S. Grant for Shiloh. Both had survived life's adversities by intellectual brilliance, tenacity, and bravado. Both were, at that moment, the most unusual people in the territory. Their relationship would be a failure. By offering his pardon bargain to Lew Wallace, Billy could not know that he was heading into tragedy, where the only possible outcome was disaster. The pardon bargain looked simple. Just weeks after the Ring murder of anti-Ring attorney Houston Chapman in Lincoln, Billy approached Governor Lew Wallace. He knew that Wallace would recognize his name, since Wallace had placed an astronomical dead or alive reward of $1,000 on his head. That's about $28,000 today. Wallace had come to Lincoln to interview citizens, so Billy, by a letter to Wallace on about March 13th, offered to trade his eyewitness testimony in 1879's April grand jury against Chapman's murderers for a pardon for his Lincoln County war indictments for regulator killings of William Brady, George Hinman, and Andrew Buckshot Roberts. But as I discussed in Talk 7 about my authenticating a new Billy the Kid letter, Billy's pardon request may have also been secretly backed by anti-Ring public officials who saw him as the Lincoln County War's hero. They were Justice of the Peace John Squire Wilson and jailer Juan Patrone. They provided the fine stationery for some of Billy's pardon plea letters. Wilson gave his home for a Billy Wallace meeting, and Patrone offered his home for Billy's sham jailing. Adding complexity is that Wallace was not really committed to the pardon. First of all, he knew about U.S. Attorney T.B. Catron's federal indictment of Billy and the other regulators for the Buckshot Roberts killing. He knew that only President Rutherford B. Hayes could issue that pardon. Wallace could only pardon for the territorial indictments for the Brady and Hinman killings. Secondly, to avoid confronting the Ring, Wallace was using its outlaw myth to fake activity by pursuing past regulators. Thirdly, he didn't like Billy. Billy's cocky attitude of being an equal to any man stimulated Wallace's competitive and sadistic feelings. Elitist Wallace required adulation even from his wife and son. Lastly, Wallace knew the Ring wouldn't tolerate pardoning the last freedom fighter who could renew anti-Ring rebellions. So Wallace let Billy testify, but delayed action to assess his personal risk from pardoning. Then Wallace's betrayal crystallized by coincidence. The outcome of the court of inquiry against past Fort Stanton commander N.A.M. Dudley was a Ring victory. Wallace, who testified against Dudley, realized the Ring was unbeatable. Sadly, there was no way for Billy or his backers to anticipate betrayal. But once it became obvious, months hence, Billy's backers retreated into silence. Billy would ultimately have to face the Ring in court, unpardoned and alone, but defiant. When Billy sent Wallace his letter of March 13th, there was reason for him to trust Wallace. Wallace represented the regulators' only Lincoln County war victory, removal of Ringite Governor Samuel Beach Axtell. That was why Wallace got the job. So it was reasonable to assume that he cared about the freedom fight that made him Axtell's midterm replacement. There was reason for Billy to make a pardon request. Wallace's November 13, 1878 amnesty proclamation had excluded those already indicted, and Billy may have gotten legal input from his backers or even his new attorney, Ira Leonard. In his letter to Wallace, he correctly asked for annulling his indictments, not pardoning, which was after sentencing. There was reason for Billy's audacious egalitarianism. As a teenager, he had become a wartime hero the year before. As an anti-ring zealot, he was now continuing his agenda, which already included his affidavit against John Tunstall's murderers, his being a deputy to serve arrest warrants on those murderers, his deposition on Tunstall's murder to presidential investigator Frank Warner Angel, and his risking death in every Lincoln County war encounter. Freed of his indictments, he could safely remain in the territory, and he apparently also hoped that Wallace could become an ally in defeating the Ring. Billy's March 13, 1879 pardon bargain letter is presented in full in Talk 6. In his fine Spencerian script, it was downright brash. As to Wallace's huge dead or alive reward, Billy airily dismissed it as negotiable. Billy wrote, "I have heard that you will give $1,000 for my body, which, as I can understand it, means alive as a witness." That segued to his bargain's terms, quote, "I know it is as a witness against those that murdered Mr. Chapman. If it was so as that I could appear in court, I could give the desired information. I was present when Mr. Chapman was murdered and know who did it." That meant the exchange of his testimony for the annulling. Realistic about the murderous ring, Billy added needing protection, writing that, quote, "My enemies would kill me." The ball was then in Wallace's court. Billy wrote, "Please send me an answer telling me what you can do." Wallace was suddenly offered a solution to his Chapman crisis, wrapped in romance of an outlaw boy of the wild frontier, and he had already arrested and incarcerated in Fort Stanton the accused murderers, James Dolan, Billy Campbell, and Jesse Evans. On March 15th, Lew Wallace, in full authoritarian mode, responded by letter to Billy as the wily attorney who hanged John Wilkes Booth's innocent landlady in the trial against conspirators in Abraham Lincoln's assassination. Self-serving Wallace had the potential to get the boy's testimony, then hang him as a trophy in his fake war against so-called outlaws. Pompously, Wallace even gave Billy directions around Lincoln, the town Billy obviously knew well, having been a Tunstall employee there and fighting in its war's battle 8 months earlier. And Wallace insultingly linked him to outlaw Jesse Evans, one of Tunstall's and Chapman's killers. Wallace wrote, "If you could trust Jesse Evans, you can trust me." More ominous was Wallace's trick wording by writing, "I have the authority to exempt you from prosecution if you will testify to what you say you know." Wallace may have had the authority, but he didn't promise to use it to pardon Billy. Further indicating trickery, as mentioned, is that he did not have the authority to pardon Billy for the federal indictment for the Buckshot Roberts killing. I take all this as proof that Wallace, even at the start, was merely setting a trap to capture Billy and later decide his fate. But was Wallace actually legally bound after Billy met the bargain's one condition? Wallace had repeated that condition in his letter, quote, "If you will testify to what you say you know." And as governor, Wallace did have the power for territorial pardons. So did Wallace's tricky wording void the bargain? Leaving out that Wallace had no power to exempt Billy from the federal indictment, he could not wiggle out of the territorial indictment's bargain by ambiguous wording. It was legally validated by tit-for-tat expectation. Black's Law Dictionary states that an agreement is a manifestation of mutual assent by two or more persons. The parties' actual bargain is found in their language or by course of performance. As to bargain, Black's Law Dictionary states it is an agreement between parties for the exchange of promises or performances. So if Billy testified, Wallace was legally required to pardon. Also, layman Billy would have understood Wallace's March 15th letter as a promise. In his March 4th, 1881 letter to Wallace from the Santa Fe jail, Billy wrote, "I have done everything that I promised you I would, and you have done nothing that you promised me." A promise, according to Black's Law Dictionary, is the manifestation of an intention to act in a specified manner, conveyed in such a way that another is justified in understanding that a commitment has been made, or a person's assurance that the person will do something. Close quote. That concept of promise is strengthened by intertwined mutuality, as in, if I do this, you will do that. Black's Law Dictionary states about mutual promises: promises given simultaneously by two parties, each promise serving as a consideration for the other, with consideration being an act or a return promise. So if Wallace reneged on annulling territorial indictments after Billy testified, or later refused to pardon him after his 1881 sentencing, when even the federal indictment had been quashed, Wallace would betray not only Billy, but his legal obligation and integrity. But Wallace did betray the bargain. Billy did testify. Wallace issued no pardon. Since Wallace was no sociopath like Ringites, his conscience tormented him for the rest of his life, though he hid his guilt in articles blaming outlaw Billy the Kid breaking the pardon bargain, not him. There was more. In Billy's desperate March 2nd, 1881 letter from the Santa Fe jail, which particularly annoyed guilty Wallace as blackmail, Billy wrote, "I have some letters which date back 2 years, and there are parties who are very anxious to get them, but I will not dispose of them until I see you, that is, if you come immediately." Dating back 2 years puts the letters in this 1879 pardon bargain period, implying Wallace had put the promise in writing. If so, Wallace, who kept copies of his correspondence with Billy, despicably expurgated this evidence, and Billy's originals are lost. But there are other clues as to those lost letters. After Billy's April 28, 1881 jailbreak, he first went to the ranch of a friend named John Meadows. Meadows's recollections were posthumously printed in a 2004 book titled Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid as I Knew Them. In it, Meadows referred to Billy's owning a letter from Wallace about the pardon promise. Though Meadows garbled the bargain as based on standing trial instead of testifying in a trial, it repeats Billy's claim of having letters. Meadows wrote, "He had a letter which he showed me from the governor, Lew Wallace, which said that if he came in and stood his trial and was convicted, the governor would pardon him." And on June 8, 1902, near the end of his life, Wallace published in New York World magazine an article titled "General Lew Wallace Writes a Romance of Billy the Kid." In it, Wallace quoted himself from their meeting. "Testify before the grand jury and the trial court and convict the murderer of Chapman, and I will let you go scot-free with a pardon in your pocket for all your misdeeds." That confirmed, after his decades of hiding it, that Wallace knew that he had made the pardon bargain. Furthermore, another Wallace letter was revealed in 1880. That year, Secret Service operative Azariah Wild was in the territory. He was approached by Billy's attorney, Ira Leonard, about making a different pardon bargain. Wild, in his report written on October 8th, referenced it. He wrote, "Governor Wallace has issued a proclamation granting immunity to those not indicted, but as Antrim, meaning Billy, has been indicted, the proclamation did not cover his case." Then Wild mentioned the letter, stating, "Governor Wallace has since written Antrim's attorney on the subject, saying he should be let go, but has failed to put it in shape that satisfied Judge Leonard, Antrim's attorney." This implies well-meaning but lackluster attorney Leonard's failure. He apparently never petitioned in court for the pardon to put Wallace on the spot to respond legally, and unfortunately, this Wallace letter is also lost. All this means that by March 15, 1879, Billy was correct to believe that he had a pardon bargain. For him, the issue was how to fulfill it without being murdered first by the ring. In his letter of March 15th, Wallace proposed a meeting in Lincoln on the 17th and stated, "The object of the meeting at Squire Wilson's is to arrange the matter in a way to make your life safe." No transcript exists of this meeting. Its witness was Justice of the Peace John Squire Wilson, in whose house it occurred. Presumably, Wallace repeated his pardon promise, and he and Billy planned his sham arrest to conceal that he would be a witness for the prosecution. But a calamity occurred on March 18th. Jesse Evans and Billy Campbell, two of the potential defendants, escaped from Fort Stanton. Remaining was James Dolan. That resulted in a March 20th flurry of letters as Billy tried to determine if the pardon bargain still existed. Billy first wrote to Wilson as Friend Wilson, questioning if Wallace wanted to make, quote, different arrangements to the sham arrest plan, which he gave for the next day. Wilson got it to Wallace, who wrote back to Wilson that Sheriff George Kimbrell should do the sham arrest. That implied that the bargain was still in effect. Wallace also enclosed a letter for Billy. Only Wallace's draft of it exists. That's fortunate, because Wallace's cross-outs reveal his ongoing attempt at deceit. Wallace wrote, "The escape makes no difference in the arrangements." Then he crossed out, I will comply with my part if you will with yours. Wallace was still trying to hedge his bets. Billy responded to Wallace immediately, fine-tuning his dangerous arrest. He wrote, "I am not afraid to die like a man fighting, but would not like to be killed like a dog unarmed." He assumed he would be held in Ring stronghold Fort Stanton, so he wrote, "All I am afraid of is that in the fort we might be poisoned or killed through a window at night, but you can arrange that all right. There will be danger on the road of somebody waylaying us to kill us on the road to the fort." Billy also changed the arrest site, and he made a bid in his search for a father figure. He offered to help Wallace capture the escapees. He wrote, "You will never catch those fellows on the road. Watch Fritz's, Captain Baca's ranch, and the brewery. They will either go to Seven Rivers or to Jicarilla Mountains. They will stay around close until the scouting parties come in. Give a spy a pair of glasses and let him get on the mountain back of Fritz's and watch. And if they are there will be provisions carried to them. It is not my place to advise you, but I am anxious to have them caught, and perhaps know how men hide from soldiers better than you." This joke was Billy's takeoff on Wallace's failing to catch him with soldiers. Teasing Billy clearly thought a friendship was forming. He was wrong. Billy's sham jailing was made safer by his friend anti-ring jailer Juan Patron. Patron offered his home for it instead of dangerous Fort Stanton. Lew Wallace kept in close touch with Secretary of the Interior Carl Schurz. In his own search for a father figure and for approval, he sent frequent self-congratulatory letters to him and to President Hayes. On March 21st, just after Billy was incarcerated, Wallace wrote a chilling letter to Schurz. Ominously, he mentions having gotten affidavits about Chapman's murder, but hides Billy's testifying role and pardon. Instead, he promoted his fake campaign against outlaws as, quote, taking the head off the evil. He even enclosed ringeyed U.S. Marshal John Sherman's outlaw list, which had the Kid William Bonney as a murderer and number 14. But Wallace did mention Billy. He wrote, "To still further weaken my confidence in juries in this county, everybody has in some way been committed to one side or the other in the recent war. A precious specimen nicknamed the Kid, whom the sheriff is holding here in the plaza, is an object of tender regard. I heard singing and music the other night. Going to the door, I found the minstrels of the village actually serenading the fellow in his prison." So Billy appears as a random jailed outlaw, snidely called a precious specimen, exemplifying factionalism that made such riffraff an object of tender regard. Proved is that Wallace was a treacherous hypocrite. Proved is that Billy had no hope. Wallace's sadistic power over this trusting boy may also have stimulated his literary inspiration for his Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, which he was then writing. Its theme was of unjustly enslaved hero Judah Ben-Hur seeking pardon. Wallace wrote, Go now, Arius, the slave master who promised pardon, said, and do not build upon what has passed between us. Perhaps I do but play with thee. In later talks, I'll discuss how Lew Wallace's betrayal determined Billy Bonney's tragic fate.